it's my great pleasure to introduce our next panel, which is, let me find the correct one, which is panel 4, Evidencing Psychological or Mental Harm. We are still running quite late, about half an hour late. We apologise for this. Please bear with us. We've had various technical hiccups here and there. It's my great pleasure to introduce Nuri Turkel, who will be chairing this panel, who is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Nuri.
I guess I am the only one who's joining virtually to this conversation. As Professor Finlay stated, the title of this panel is Evidencing Psychological or Mental Harm. That is one of the most important aspects of what is happening to the Uyghur people. One of the most important things that I have observed through my Uyghur human rights work and policy work in Washington and around the world is to witness the Uyghur people, especially in diaspora, suffering mental health issues. Because of the sense of guilt, anxiety, the hopelessness. This panel, through our expert panelists, will examine various aspects of the psychological harm and available evidences relating to what the Uyghur people are going through, particularly in the Uyghur homeland, Xinjiang or East Turkestan. We have our first speaker will be Dr. Sam TYNEN. She's a research fellow at Oriental Institute at Czech Academy of Science. She holds PhD in human geography from University of Colorado Boulder. Sam lived in China for a total of 5 years, from 2009 through 2017. Sam's research focuses on state buildings, nationalism, and ethnic conflict in China. Her presentation will be on crimes against humanity, mental and psychological harm, and survival. Sam, floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. My name is Sam TYNEN, and my pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I like to keep things interesting. So the paper that I'm presenting on today is a peer review, under peer review right now with the Journal of Asian Ethnicity. But I haven't gotten the reviews back yet. So please, any questions or comments about my argument are more than welcome. I'd love to talk with you after as well, so I can improve the paper. But the paper that I wrote is branching off of this paper, which I already published in the Journal of Political Geography. So this paper was published as Keep Withstanding, Territory in the Body, Home and Market in Xinjiang, China. And in this paper, I was specifically looking at vendors and vendors in the marketplace. And so I wanted to write a paper about how Uyghur people also coped with psychological oppression and mental harm if they were wealthy. So the paper I wrote before was about survivance for the most vulnerable populations, the most economically insecure individuals in Urumqi. But I also did a lot of observations about the more wealthy Uyghurs and how they coped with it. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is inspired by something that I saw on Instagram by the account Seeding Sovereignty. And I saw this the other day, and I was like, this is exactly what I'm trying to say. So this is just a reminder that we want to learn about Indigenous brilliance and success as much as you learn about Indigenous suffering and trauma. This conference is amazing, and I'm so glad that we're here to talk and collaborate on the suffering and trauma of the Uyghur people. And I think it's just as important to talk about the ways that the Uyghur people coped with and lived in the military police state of China as a complex, beautiful, diverse society, an unequal society that was divided very strongly by class between the wealthy individuals and the impoverished individuals. There was a huge divide in terms of just socioeconomic access to resources, but also just cultural differences between the urban and the rural areas. And so I do think that there's a narrative in the Xinjiang scholarship that focuses a lot on victimization of the Uyghurs and also painting the Uyghurs as one coherent monolith group. And both of those things I think need to be challenged more. Jo Smith-Finley wrote about this in her book, which she called Symbolic Resistance. And Gardner Bovingdon also talked about it, and he talked about it more as quiet resistance or this kind of thing, everyday resistance. And so I'm building on their conversations and saying, okay, how else can we understand what is kind of resistance and also what I call survivance, which I'm building on Indigenous scholarship based in Australia to use that word survivance. But I do think it's a spectrum of resistance and survivance. But I think what I saw was more survivance than resistance. And I think that speaks to the ways that the situation was escalating when I was there from 2014 to 2017 and the way that people became really hopeless. And so when you're in a hopeless situation and you're in a military police state, but you also have access to wealth, how do you deal with this? And in the historical scholarship on Nazi Germany, there is research on the ways that artists coped with life during Nazi Germany, which was that they call it culture during dark times or flight of fantasy. This is a way that people escape psychologically from the physical condition or the physical state, but they are still there physically, but they escape psychologically. And so this is what I witnessed when I was there, specifically among the wealthy population, more wealthy population that could afford luxuries such as going out and partying, going to dance clubs, these kinds of things. So I also base my work on the theory that body is a type of territory. I like to use this picture because you can see there is a woman in the foreground with her head covered with a headscarf. And so this is just one example of the ways that people all around the world can use their bodies as a way to reclaim territory. There's also a man in the background with what people often call the shepka. Another way for Uyghur people to show their cultural identity was through things like hats that made them look more European than Chinese. You can also see the mosque in the background. At this time, again, this was 2014 to 2017. So the military state was escalating while I was there, but it was not as bad as what the reports are saying now. You can see the mosque in the background. So this was also a really important space for Uyghur people, Uyghur men especially, to go and pray and have a space of community. And so I'm using this theory as I kind of work through this literature and understanding how important it was for Uyghur people to have sovereignty over their own body. And a lot of times that came through in things like dance, playing musical instruments, singing, of course. And again, I just want to point out on my own subjectivity here is another common trope, right, is the exoticization of Uyghurs too, as reduced to just song and dance, right? And so I'm just trying to bring in the importance of culture and song, dance, food, of course, right, as we see on this slide, as a way to cope with the situation. People still found ways to be with their families, to find spaces in the home, such as you can see here, in their own bodies, such as through food or other dress, as a way to reclaim sovereignty over their bodies, even in the oppression of the Chinese police state. And this is a picture of a market. And one thing, and this is going back to the people in the markets, but the other reason why this is important is because, yes, we are talking about the Chinese Communist Party and we are talking about the Chinese authoritarian state, but we are also talking about a capitalist economy. And that's why it's important to understand these spaces. So the space I have up here on the screen is of the dance club. Spaces where wealthier Uyghurs could go and celebrate with their own culture, but also drink alcohol, smoke hookah, have fun, escape, party, and also consume. Spend money as a way to forget their problems, escape the military police state, be in a space that was more fun. So the example that I'm going to give before I wrap up is from Golba Shikar. So anybody who was in Xinjiang knows Golba Shikar. It was a coffee shop. So I argue that the coffee shops were one way for wealthier Uyghurs, of course, not necessarily wealthy, but at least middle class or above, who could afford nutritionally unnecessary things like coffee and desserts that were actually necessary for them to just cope with everything that was going on. So I'm just going to read a description of inside the coffee shop. When I walked into the Turkish coffee shop Golba Shikar, I felt as though I was attending a romantic and gluttonous party. The menu featured coffee mochas with towering whipped cream, a delectable selection of 12 different flavors of ice cream, and extravagantly ornate chocolate tiramisu cakes. They were advertised as Turkish dessert. Uzbek music blasted a little too loud on the speakers, and people spoke loudly to be heard over the music, creating a buzz of laughter and chatter all around me. I saw a couple feeding each other bites of cake. Teenagers sat together, not talking, but tapping on their phones vigorously with intense concentration. A group of middle-aged men wearing dopa sat in a circle in the middle of the room, multiple tables pushed together, talking loudly and laughing boisterously with each other. And on one particular day at this coffee shop, I met up with a friend and we ordered ice cream. She took a selfie of us and she airbrushed my pimples, made our skin instantly whiter, and put it together in a collage for her social media. While we were posting this curated image of ourselves and our night out, a night of pleasure and escape through ice cream and cozy coffee shops, surrounded by foreign music and huge pictures of cake. Our night was disrupted by a raspy voice. Please, won't you buy some? 3 for 10 som. I turned and a boy looked up at me, no older than 5. His face dirty, his eyes tired, wiggling and squirming as he stood next to our table. His head was barely just high enough to peer over the table. He was presenting packages of wet wipes for sale and staring at our food. This was common in the city to see small children selling paper or wipes, little Kleenex. We shook our heads no and went back to burying our heads in our phones, trying to escape this uncomfortable moment of sitting in his need and begging. He pushed us, asking again. We told him, "Kahazba," a little too harshly. He turned and walked away. Meanwhile, servers with black baseball caps and orange sweatshirts bustled around the crowds, clearing trash and returning dishes to the kitchen. When we left the coffee shop, a father stood at the entrance to the mosque right across the street, holding his 2 young children in his arms while he rocked back and forth, chanting and begging for help. Passerbys occasionally dropped a 1 UN note into the blanket in front of him. So I tell this story, this is just one example, but my main argument is to say that leisure practices, such as the dance club, such as the coffee shop, among some other activities, including studying English, perpetuated class inequality at the end of the day, and the capitalist system that oppresses them. But these spaces also constituted an important space and time for Uyghur Muslim identity. So it's not black and white, good or bad, but there were lots of things going on with the inequality that was dividing the Uyghurs in the region, but also providing escape. So why do we care about this? I do think that, at least from what I saw, the wealthy Uyghurs took back some control over the space and time of their bodies through leisure. And I do think that escapism in bodily pleasures are necessary for survival under oppressive regimes. What does this tell us? It tells us that bodies are a form of territory, and bodies are the focus of both control and liberation. I think I'm not going to read this. I think I'm over time. So I'm just going to stop there. But these are my conclusions. And yeah, so this is my website and this is my Twitter. So I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Look forward to reading your paper once it's published. Our next speaker is Rahima MAHMUT. She is a UK project director for the World Uyghur Congress. She is a Uyghur singer. Prison memoir entitled "The Land of Drenched in Tears" by Sheneshev. The latest work includes working as a consultant and translator for the ITV documentary that I highly recommend for all of you to watch. The name of the documentary is Undercover Inside China's Digital Blog, that was shown on Frontline recently in 2020, I believe, either last year or early this year. Rahima is also a translator for the latest BBC documentary, China, A New World Order. Rahima will be discussing the role that Uyghur women play in society, using her own experience as a Uyghur woman growing up in Gulji city. She will also discuss the experiences of Uyghur women living in the region of them have faced, as been reported, forced marriage and sterilization. Rahima, floor is yours.
So all over again. So good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to thank Joe and all the wonderful supporters who have worked very hard to make today's conference happen. And I feel very honored to be among so many amazing friends. So today I'm going to talk about the shattering impact that the genocide has had specifically on Uyghur and Kazakh women. When we talk about the Chinese regime's treatment of Uyghur women, we often talk about the immediate violence they face, the detention, torture, rape. These things are shocking, and they have disgusted the world watching on. But today I want to widen our view and explain how the violence against Uyghur and Kazakh women in East Turkestan is. So the first slide, please. So it is calculated. It deliberately targets the role women play in preserving Uyghur community. It is extensive. It is physical, sexual, and psychological violence. And it is far-reaching, experienced by women living in the Uyghur region, by women currently in camps, but also by women in exile. So generally, in education and status, the Uyghurs Uyghur women is a strong characteristics of women's of Uyghur society, of the Uyghur society. At a basic level, women preserve communities by having children, but they are also caregivers and teachers. They shape the way children understand the world. In Uyghur communities, they are culture carriers. The Chinese regime's targeting of our women is a deliberate attempt to destroy not only the people that gave birth to a new generation, but also the people that teach that new generation about their culture, language, and history. Slide 3, please. So women in the region will talk about the outside of the camp. Outside of the camp. The regime is destroying the Uyghur community's capacity to reproduce through a mass program of forced sterilizations, forced IUD fittings, and forced abortions. And we heard about the research from Dr. Adrian Zenz has exposed the scale and impact that this is having in the population rate. He found that these policies could reduce the Uyghur population by up to 1/3 over the next 20 years, preventing up to 4.5 million new lives. Women are also traumatized through forced marriages, having CCP officials moved into their homes whilst the husbands are in camps, and having their children taken to prison like orphanages. And I have met many mothers in Turkey, and the pain that they are suffering is just unimaginable. Slide 4, please. So inside the camp, what's happening to the women in camps? By now, all of us have heard the horrors that faced by the Uyghur and Kazakh women in the concentration camps. The testimonies of camp survivors can be painful to hear, but I believe it is important we bear witness to these stories. And rape has become a primary weapon during this genocide. We have heard stories of almost constant, systematic rape used in interrogations, used to punish women, to traumatize them. Women have been forced to watch the rape of others. And we heard this from Sairagul Saudbai's testimony during the Uyghur Tribunal and many other interviews that she had given to media, and also have been forced to undress their fellow detainees and clean them afterwards. And I interpreted for Gulzira Ayul Khan, and I will never forget when she first time spoke about her experience, she was sobbing uncontrollably. And this is what is happening inside a camp. And this violence is a weapon designed to inflict long-term psychological damage. Its purpose is to make women hate themselves and to strip them of their tools of resistance. Slide 5, please. So, women in exile. And my work in translating has brought me into close contact with survivors. And I have seen firsthand how these experiences have emotionally destroyed the women in our community. And in June, when we had several survivors came to London and to give evidence, we could see very different picture of them, and physically, psychologically, they need a lot of help. I can see that the trauma of what they have faced, particularly the sexual violence, is often too painful to bear. But what we must also understand is that the loss of children is often the most intolerable pain women experience. They live with it every day. Many of the women I have interpreted for have lost 3 or 4 children. A lot of them left to save their unborn babies, but then lost all the children they left behind. I could see that these women had developed severe mental health conditions. They suffer depression and anxiety on a daily basis. It is vital that they receive specialist support from the countries in which they have sought refuge. So the last. So for me, as a singer, interpreter, and campaigner, it is important that we do not allow this suffering to overshadow the female strengths and the intellect that it is designed to destroy. And we know Tusnay Ziauddin's one of her very famous interview that she said when she was asked why the CCP is doing this. She said it's designed to destroy everyone's spirit. So for me, living in exile in free country, I try not to allow the CCP to win. So what we are doing now, coming to the conference to give voice to the people who doesn't have the voice, and also carry our culture using whatever ability and the talents that God given, continue and to work and try to preserve the beautiful Uyghur culture, music, poetry. And it is what pushes us to continue teaching our children about our culture and the language. Our spirit is found in our music, poetry, literature, our history, and our stories. I feel that as an Uyghur woman in exile, it is my duty to carry on this spirit, especially for the women in my homeland that cannot. I'm a singer and I continue to sing the songs and poems of Uyghur women to make sure our voices are carried on to the next generation. So I 100% agree with my friend who said the Uyghurs are not victims or survivors. I believe we are the survivors and we will continue to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahima, for those remarkably powerful statement about the willpower of the Uyghur people to survive this through. I am personally grateful for all the work that you've done, particularly promoting Uyghur culture even before the crisis started.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Joe and Hannah and everyone else working behind the scenes to make this conference work. As my title suggests, I'm going to focus today on the issue of child separation or transfer of children from one group to another. But before I want to do that, I would like to address something that the conference organizers suggested to me. They gave me the option of making some comments on whether I think that what's happening in Eastern Turkestan or Xinjiang constitutes genocide. My answer to that question in a formal setting like this is that I'm not qualified to judge because I don't have training in genocide studies or in human rights law. But that those who do have training or special expertise in those fields, those of those specialists who have written about this question have either determined that it is a genocide or that there is good reason to suspect a possible genocide. In the last 3 years, I've read more in the fields of genocide studies and international law, human rights law, than I ever thought I would. It's still not much. I've only scratched the surface, but one thing I've noticed is that these fields are incredibly complicated, incredibly rich. They involve highly technical matters, highly nuanced engagements with an incredibly robust literature that is quite daunting. And so I'm inclined at this time, now that we have at this point in the crisis where we actually have experts in genocide determination and the nature of genocide and the legal status of genocide. Now that we have these people as part of the conversation, I feel like as a specialist in the history and culture of Xinjiang, I have more to offer in seeking the facts about what is happening on the ground and less in terms of how to categorize it in terms of genocide versus crimes against humanity versus something else. I don't offer this, I'm not trying to prescribe this approach to others. I think that the fact that the field of Xinjiang studies and Uyghur studies has been debating the question of genocide has been important in bringing this issue to those who specialize in genocide studies and law. And in fact, before our field began to debate that, there weren't specialists who were weighing in on the question, which really left it to us. But now that those specialists are part of the conversation, I'm reluctant to sort of formally make a judgment or an argument in one way or the other. And for me, this is because I see some risks in doing so. Just to put it in very simple terms, I could say that there's a genocide and then have experts later come along and say, make a very good case or establish a consensus that there is not. That seems unlikely right now because all the publication we've seen so far, opinions we've seen so far, lean toward the genocide determination. And the risks, the dangers, the harms in that would primarily be reputational, undermining some of the maybe independence of the field of Xinjiang studies and Uyghur studies, but I don't think too severely. The second, I think, more dangerous risk is if I were to say there's not a genocide on some technical argument or non-technical argument, and then the experts were to, in genocide studies and law, were to come along after and say, actually, this is a clear case of genocide, establish a consensus or make very strong arguments. That would put me in the position of having denied a genocide by virtue of presuming to be able to make judgments well beyond my expertise. At the same time, working against the broad perception among Uyghurs that what their community is experiencing is a genocide. So, and of course, then additionally weakening the power of that term to bring attention to what's happening to the Uyghurs. So I think there are some pretty serious risks in at this point, while we have experts in genocide studies and the law in reaching beyond our expertise. And I don't, as I said, I don't mean to prescribe this approach for others, but just simply to highlight the risk and explain my own approach. In addition, I would like to just note that, taking into account these risks can happen while engaging in the debate. I think Joe Smith-Finley's piece in the Journal of Genocide Research is a great example. It's extremely cautious. It surveys other people's opinions about whether this is genocide or not. And very importantly, it's published in a venue directed towards specialists in the field. So it's an engagement with those specialists. And of course, it had to be vetted by peer reviewers who are specialists in the field. So I think there are, it's something that can be done, but it has to be done quite cautiously and with a full view of the incredibly large ramifications of making these arguments. Okay, that said, let me move on to doing what I think I'm more qualified to do, which is to explore some of the evidence about what is actually happening on the ground. In terms of the issue of transfer of children from one group to another or child separation, most of what has appeared in the media is reporting on orphanages. And indeed, there has been an incredible explosion of orphanage construction in Xinjiang. And it is a big issue, but I want to focus more, I'll talk about the orphanages a little bit, but I want to focus more on boarding schools simply because they are equally large or perhaps larger in terms of numbers, and they have gotten much less attention. So they appear in a New York Times, important New York Times piece. And then Adrian Zenz has a nice analysis of the boarding school issue in a Medium post, but it's much shorter than a lot of his other work. And beyond that, there's not really much extended discussion of the boarding schools. First, though, the orphanages. We have a report by Associated Press of something around 50 construction bids for orphanages in a roughly a 1 year period. I went back to the database of construction bids and was able to track down 44 bids myself. So I can confirm that, not that it was really necessary, that that in fact that this construction boom really did happen. But I also went and looked at a neighboring province of Gansu to be sure that this wasn't a nationwide boom in orphanage construction. And indeed, Gansu has only 16% the number of orphanages being built as Xinjiang. It's also worth noting that the Chinese state's own pronouncements about orphans nationwide boast that the number of orphans has fallen precipitously over the last 10 years, which would make you wonder why you need to build a bunch of orphanages in Xinjiang. In addition, the number of beds in orphanages across China has fluctuated in a very narrow band over the last 10 years. So there's no national move toward building orphanages. This is something very particular to Xinjiang. Okay, let me move on to the boarding schools. we have great access to information at the sort of high general level, numbers level, about boarding schools in Xinjiang, because the Xinjiang Education Department produced a report for the Central Education Department, in which they declared that the main thrust of their planning for 2018 and 19 and onward is the move toward boarding schools in Xinjiang. And using that document and another one, that document was first turned up by the New York Times. Using this document and others, we can calculate that close to 400,000 students were shifted into boarding schools. And by boarding schools, I'm specifying, as opposed to orphanages, I'm specifying elementary schools and middle schools. Close to 400,000 students, 380-something thousand students, were shifted to boarding schools between 2017 and 2019. And I think the most remarkable number is in the middle schools, where the state says that by the end of 2018, 49% of all students in Xinjiang were in boarding schools at the middle school age. A few years ago, Xinjiang was way behind the rest of China in its boarding school rate. China has an unusually high rate of boarding schools. As of 2010, it was 22% of students across China. In other parts of China, this is due to the migration of adults from rural areas and whole families from rural areas to urban areas, which depletes rural schools of students, forcing them to consolidate, making travel times bigger for students who need to move to these consolidated schools, and therefore incentivizing boarding rather than long distance commuting. But Xinjiang, as of say 2010, was nowhere near this number. It was quite far behind. Largely, I would suggest because it didn't have this same economic pressure of migration to the cities on the same scale. We see Xinjiang not only catch up but surpass that number by a small amount in the years of 2017, 18, and into 2019, with a call for further expansion of the boarding schools. So this lines up precisely with the period of mass internment and all of the other policies we're talking about at this conference. Within the Xinjiang Department of Education report, we also get pretty clear language about the purpose of this. The boarding schools are distinctly not being promoted in order to address these kinds of demographic and migratory economic issues. They are explicitly aimed at quote security and social stability. And they say that the security and social stability is achieved by cultural interventions among students. So, for example, in the opening paragraph, they say that boarding schools are necessary to prevent children from being influenced by the religious ideas of their families, and to prevent the shocks of moving back and forth and the backflow of ideas from the family to the children. Essentially, and now these are my words and not the reports, essentially they're concerned that the family is undoing the education in Han-dominated culture that the students are receiving at schools, and the way to solve that is to just keep the children away from their families. The same document also notes that the #1 priority in recruiting teachers is that they're good at teaching good at teaching Chinese, that Chinese must be used in the schools not as just a teaching language, but as a language of operation. And they boast that they've had an unprecedented recruitment of Han Chinese instructors. So it's clear that these boarding schools are made for assimilation as an attack on the Uyghur group as it exists today, and other minority groups as they exist today. I'll just reiterate again in closing that this number, I think, of 49% is a quite stunning number. It's not 49% of middle school students being placed in boarding schools. It's not separated out by ethnic group, so it probably actually disproportionately affects the Han, because Han Chinese are more likely to seek boarding schools across China. But the vast majority of students in Xinjiang, the vast majority of children, something in the 70%, I think it's 76%, are actually indigenous groups or minorities, not Han. This is presumably because of differential birth rates in the past. So this 49% number is quite significant and suggests that a very large portion, perhaps half or more, because these policies have been the report also has plans in it to make more boarding schools. So it's quite likely that half or more of the children among indigenous groups like the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others have been separated from their families at the middle school age. The number is smaller for elementary school, and this, I think, points to a much broader and, I think, more even more disturbing pattern of child separation than what has been depicted so far. And with that, I will close. Thank you all for your attention, and I welcome feedback.
Our next speaker is Emily Upson. She is a student at Newcastle University and author of Uyghur Human Rights Project report, Uyghur Human Rights Project report published recently on Proof of Life videos. Emily?
Hello there, and thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you all. It has been such an honor to fumble your technology and to share a microphone with so many wonderful people today. So the presentation today is on Proof of Life videos. I wrote a report on this last year for UHRP, Uyghur Human Rights Project. I was very lucky to do so. And by Proof of Life videos, I'm referring to Chinese state media's propaganda videos that feature an allegedly missing or detained Uyghur that is in some way prominent to international discourse. Today, I am going to kind of rearrange some of that. I'm going to rearrange some of the information that I included in that report to look at different ways that we can utilize some of that information for international activism or concern. So I think the first thing to note is that out of the 22 videos analysed, I strongly found that this was targeted towards English speakers. This is not for a Chinese audience and is largely for intimidating Uyghurs or for clumsily and ineffectively trying to change international opinion about Xinjiang. They are presented as spontaneous investigations, and they are nothing of the sort. I will try to keep that as brief as possible and move on for those of you who have already heard me talk about this. This is the report. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is media laws. So Safeguard Defenders responded to my report with an excellent article, kind of comparing proof of life videos to forced confessions, and using the formula that I listed out of the 22 videos to look at the ways in which they are similar and fit the same playbook as forced confessions do. And so I took their scripted and staged report and found their recommendations. And so the first one is asking Chinese media to register as foreign agents. Now that has largely been taken up thanks to social media giants, Facebook, YouTube, all underlining where state financing has come into play, as well as using existing tools to impose sanctions, which is interesting because on the 26th of August, barely a week ago, Ofcom faced a lot of pressure, and even though they have revoked CGTN's license in February 2021, they recently fined the company £200,000 for fines regarding alleged confessions aired between 2016 and 2019. This was kept very vague, but I think this is an excellent avenue to kind of approach proof of life videos with. And the next one is by using the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Degrading has no definition within this convention. The European Commission has tried to offer one, and that's something I think worked very well. But the link to proof of life videos is how degrading they are, how debasing. And Professor He Bing referred to this as the street parades of yesterday have become the television parades of today. And the shame parades in the Cultural Revolution were very much degrading in similar ways, I think. Abdurrahim Hayat, his proof of life video has clear signs of physical torture, despite him saying himself that there was no conviction. Namahet Toti, his neighbour, was forced to appear in a proof of life video claiming that he died of natural causes, which if you believe human rights witnesses, which you should, he didn't, he died in detention. So appearing in a proof of life video crying about his natural caused death is particularly degrading. Appearing in happy videos, again, Sam dancing or singing, it's particularly upsetting. And there are certain proof of life videos with character assassinations, claiming sexual promiscuity, calling names, claiming that the person in question has abused children. Some really horrible stuff. Protection against indifference by the UDHR, against interference, sorry. That's in Article 12. Nobody shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, and all four of those things are very much interfered with in proof of life videos when Uyghurs have no choice but to feature. You can see here that in Aziz Nayiz, in his videos, there are 3 costume changes for him and his wife. This is not a spontaneous, freely given interview, even without the formula and what we know about Xinjiang, as is, these are highly choreographed and manipulated situations. You can also see that the fruit on the table is moving and rearranging in different ways, and I don't think that's a coincidence. You'll see the timestamps are different, and it's unclear if they're trying to give the impression of several interviews or what exactly is happening, but there's heavy interference there. These 2 parents lost their child who drowned in a lake while they were in detention. They appeared in a proof of life video to say that they have been free the whole time and that their child died of negligence. That was a particularly hard video to watch, and I think it very much is an interference and cruel. And the last one I want to talk about is witness intimidation, which is possibly the biggest stretch that I'm going to talk about today. It's under Article 70 of the Rome Statute, which criminalizes false testimony or evidence and other witness interferences. Jean-Pierre Bemba Gombo and 4 associates of his were sentenced and found guilty in October 2016. This was under the ICC. China is not a part of the Rome Statute at all, so it's currently not super relevant, but this has sparked wide discussion about how exactly we can further witness intimidation and fortify some kind of framework here. Robert Cryer, Mark Kirsten, Justice in Conflict, Open Society, as well as the Office of the Prosecutor for the ICC, in their 2016 to 18 strategic plan, they've kind of all talked about how we can work with witness intimidation, which clearly these videos are intended to do. And so when we hear about these videos in the Uyghur Tribunal or in other diplomatic arenas, I think that's something that we can be pushing as a political objective. You'll see that this is one of the main responses that Uyghurs give to these videos, seeing their families and not wanting their families to be in any harm. These videos are only one small way in which any of these kind of categories that I've talked about are being used or abused. But I think it's an important one because this evidence is given freely by Chinese state media, which is an arm of the government, arguably. And so I just want to conclude that even though it's a mild method, I haven't even talked about China domestic laws or the laws of countries where people may be migrating to. China exerts mental harm very publicly here. Thank you.
As board chairman of the Human Rights Project, I'm grateful for the work that we've done specifically on this particularly important topic. The proof of life video has been somewhat confusing in some instances that they're just releasing it, some instances for their own expediency, but in some instances they're not even bothering to release the videos of disappeared Uyghurs into the camps. Our next speaker is Dilnur REYHAN. Dilnur is an instructor at French National Institute for Oriental Studies. She's also president of the European Uyghur Institute. Dilnur holds PhD in sociology. Her research is mainly focused on identifying the Uyghur nationalism in diaspora, but she also studies gender among the Uyghur, conducts research on gender studies for the Uyghur people, both at home and abroad. Dilnur will be addressing the importance of genocide designation to the Uyghur people in particular. Before Reyhan starts, I just need to add one quick point related to this topic, that now, because of this genocide determination announced by the United States and followed by several Western parliaments, people casually discussing as if that the Uyghurs love to be associated with the genocide designation. I hope there is no such a thing. I hope we don't have to talk about genocide. I use this opportunity to caution when people casually discussing if it is genocide or not. This is very important to the Uyghur people. It provides hope and moral support that someone is speaking for them. With that, I yield the floor to Dilnur.
Salam everyone. Merci. Thank you. Oui, c'est bon? Oui. let me start my presentation with a quote of Immanuel Kant. Inhumanity inflicted on another destroys the humanity in me. The role of language is central, according to Bourdieu, because language is a representation, which, as such, has a properly symbol efficiency in the construction of reality. Words have their importance, their consequences. A single word can bear witness to horrors and dread, genocide. So why is the genocide designation important for Uyghurs? I develop it by 4 points. First, without the recognition of the crime as at its height, we cannot stop the crime in progress, much less punish the perpetrators or prevent the worst to come. It is important to remember that the affirmation, recognition of the Sino-Uyghur relationship as colonial is a first step in the recognition of the problem, without which the solution has never been found. So, on the question of the recognition of the genocide, the recognition of the colonial relationship is essential, because since 13 researchers who are also among in these conferences with us also apply the recent concept of settler colonialism, developed since 2011 by researchers Lorenzo Viracini and Patrick Wolf, to analyze the case of Uyghurs in the Uyghur region. This new concept expresses a form of colonization which differs from classical colonization by its structure and its purpose. Settler colonialism aims to disaggregate the native population by replacing it with settlers, while classical colonization seeks to dominate the colonized people. This later can end with the departure of colonists, while the settler colonialism is in a logic of elimination of the natives. This is why the theorists of this neologism warn the world against a possible genocide. Not all genocides come from a situation of settler colonialism, but settler colonialism can lead to genocide by its character of elimination of the natives. The second point, genocidal crimes are not on the same character scale as crimes against humanity, unanimously recognized as such by NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International for Uyghur case. The term genocide is above all a legal notion. Raphael Lemkin, a lawyer of Polish origin, forged in 1943 the notion of genocide made up of the Latin genus, descent, race, tribe, and cide, which kills. Thus murders, extermination, abusive imprisonments, torture, sexual violences, and forced sterilizations are constitutive elements of the crime against humanity. Constituted elements that can be found in Article 6 of the Statute of International Criminal Court concerning the crime of genocide. So why create a specific incrimination? Raphael Lemkin's goal is to score. Score by putting a name on the horror, mark it so it does not happen again. The crime against humanity targets the civilian population with a systematic repression, while the article defining the crime of genocide targets 4 target groups: national, ethnic, racial, or religious. Of course, Chinese fascist policy in the Uyghur region has also targeted the other Turkic peoples, in particular the Kazakhs, but also as much as lesser extent the Hui people. However, any investigation testimony also shows that the vast majority of this mass detention targets Uyghurs, who are specifically targeted as an ethnic and a religious group. One of the camp instructors, Dilnur REYHAN, currently living in the Holland, said that she could obtain the permission to go to abroad because she's Uzbek, and it is categorically refused to his husband because he is Uyghur. A Kazakh couple who had escaped to Kazakhstan in December 2019 have testified that they could escape because of their Kazakh identity. If they were Uyghur, it was impossible. The objective is to create a specific criminalization for specific acts. The goal is to be able to put a word, a precise word, to designate horror and inhumanity. The aim is to be able to judge legally, of course, but also morally, the instigators and the executors. The aim is to be able to fight so that this cannot happen again, because it's not the first horrors committed by the same state who had done it before already in its recent history. Misdefining crimes can only encourage the criminal state to perceive its crimes with a sense of superpower and subject the victims even further to its unpunished repression. Patrick Wolf, one of the theorists of the concept of settler colonialism, explains his rejection of the term of cultural genocide, which confuses the definition with the degree, from which the genocide emerges as being either biological or cultural, and therefore by cultural it follows not true. So a genocide can't be only cultural or only biological, never. As he rightly explains, the genocide is separated by a hyphen that devalues the attrition of the natives, especially in the case of settler colonialism, whose logic is based on security, and this logic certainly requires the elimination of the owners of this territory, the natives. Third point, the wrong designation of crime will allow the denialism to flourish. Denial is the indispensable weapon in the continuation of genocidal crimes in defiance of the victims. We all know that Chinese economic and political weight is talking in supranational institutions, and bringing China to international justice is nearly impossible unless the regime falls. At the present time, we hope to see the condemnation of the Chinese leaders for their crimes against the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples. At the present time, when the vast majority of Uyghurs in the diaspora are cut off from direct contact with their families, at present times when the majority of Uyghur students in the diaspora have temporarily or permanently lost their studies due to the budget cut provided before by their parents. At the present time, when the majority of the members of the diaspora know at least one person of their family or entourage disappeared, dead, in camps or in prison, in the absence of any hope that Chinese state criminals will be punished, official recognition of genocidal crime is essential for Uyghurs, especially since the denial of Chinese crimes, regardless of its degree, only reinforces the crimes and continues to attack the members of the diaspora, in particularly targeting the direct relatives of the victims of this genocide, who expose themselves every day to testify for their families. And as if that were not enough, comes the denial of the far right and the far left around the world, not to mention the Muslim world's support for the Chinese horrors. The worst part of all this is to think that this will continue because China will not be punished for its crimes. This is why official recognition is essential for the diaspora. It's also essential for Uyghurs and other indigenous people of the Uyghur land, because although information is strictly controlled by China, the majority of Uyghurs cannot be in direct contact and cannot talk about international wave of Uyghur movement. There were still always indirect channels to inform them all the same that, that the outside world does not forget them, especially since every time a democratic country recognizes the Uyghur genocide, Chinese television broadcasts it itself, covering the concerned country with accusations and insults, whereby people in the Uyghur land know there is hope and that they are not alone. The 4.4, proving the intention of criminals, raises the question of who to base it on the word of the criminal state or on the word of direct victims. The 1948 Convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intention of destroying, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. This even includes the non-violent destruction of such a group, when such policies, used voluntarily, knowingly bring genocidal results. Their executors can be legally judged to have intended to destroy a group, at least in part, regardlessly of their motives. Such crimes are not the same as the Holocaust, but international law has considered them to be another form of genocide. In criminal law, the term intention is not equal to the term motive. Regarding Chinese intention to destroy all or part of Uyghur nation, researchers and NGOs are divided, and some are particularly cautious while waiting for China to publicly admit its intention. For other researchers, and in particular for the Uyghur diaspora, not only the revelations of the confidential official Chinese files showing the order of Xi Jinping to have no mercy towards the Uyghurs, the intentional demographic change aimed at numerically minorizing the Uyghur population and to increase the number of Chinese settlers, notably via the massive sterilization of Uyghur women, are enough to demonstrate the intention to destroy, at least in part, the Uyghur people, even if it is assumed that the executors did not intend to commit a genocide. This is a predictable result of their actions. The regime pursued and still continue its goals, knowing that at least one side genocide could be a result of their violence. The task now requires less definitional arguments, more investigations. The reaction of concentration camp survivors is unanimous on this issue. Via their experience as camp prisoners or camp instructors, it's a genocide with intention of destroy Uyghurs as a nation. I conclude that although existing international law already provides a relevant statutory definition of genocide and a court to judge these crimes, on the other hand, the International Criminal Court does not seem a realistic option due to the influence of China on it, but also on other supranational bodies. On the other hand, unnecessary semantic arguments prevent effective punishment and deterrence. Failure to quickly bring those responsible to the International Criminal Court could turn the international community into helpless bystanders and encourage such crimes. This is why at least the official recognition of the genocide by a large part of the democratic and the humanist world is urgent for safe Uyghurs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilnur. We're supposed to have one more speaker, Professor Rian THUM, due to the bad weather, power short outage in where he is right now. He would to join us. So we're going to move on to the next part, the second part of the event, which is a Q&A. In the interest of time, as you may notice, we are running late. The next panel starts fairly soon. So we only have time for 2 questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, everybody. Much could be asked, I'm sure, but I just thought, since it feels quite relevant, I would ask Rahima regarding especially the sexual violence against women. There is some sort of underlying debate about the accuracy or reliance of testimony, which I find partially very unfortunate, but on the other hand, there is some legitimacy, of course, to try to corroborate especially very strong allegations of gang rape or mass rape, etc. Would you like to speak a little bit how we can have sort of what you think of the accuracy of claims beyond individual rape, going to like systematic rape, etc., that is going on, and how we can corroborate it, and how would you sort of respond to some of those challenges? Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. That is a very important question. For me, it's when I have eye contact with the person when I speak to, and I immediately know that whether they are speaking the truth or not, especially when you claim someone raped you, or not, let alone gang rape, you have to have such courage, and that requires huge bravery. For example, Tursunay's case, Tursunay Ziyabudun, when she gave interview first time to Guljakra when the Radio Free Asia interviewed her when she was in Kazakhstan, and I remember so clearly that her last question was, have you ever experienced or witnessed rape? And she cried, just burst out crying and said, God help us. And that was the kind of, so I started to think that maybe she experienced something really, really terrible, that for her to react to that question so immediate and and also with Saira Gul's account as well, when she spoke about that particular event, about those 100 people were assembled to this big hall, and each time when she started, her voice was trembling, and then she always cried. And I can see that, because if you are making up story, you don't have that emotion, and it's very, very clear. Also with Gulzira Avulkan Kızı, when she arrived in Turkey, I was with the BBC crew to interview. We went to investigate the organ harvesting issue, and then actually her revelation, and said, this is the first time that I am speaking about this. And she stopped for 30 seconds, couldn't bring herself up to talk about it. And then she said, my job was also to remove other women's clothes, and then have to wait by the window, and a man would come in, and then afterwards I have to, the details are also so important. I'm sure in, not only the cases, what is happening under such controlled police state, but also even in these countries, when something happened like that, it is extremely difficult to prove as well. When these things happens normally in a very private places. But what is happening in our country at the moment, from not only these 3 people, but I have spoken to many, even the prisoners who released, there's one lady in 2008. So she was in prison for 8 years. She was forced to watch for 1 year when she refused to collaborate, and then she was raped for 2 years. And she described all the place, and every time she said it's always not 1 or 2 always 4 or 5. So I just cannot believe that people can make up these stories. This is happening, and it happened, and it is happening. Thank you.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to add something else. I'm a psychoanalyst in Paris, working since 10 years with refugees and people who have been under torture, and started a little to work with refugees and people who survived the camps. So I just wanted to add a few things about how we can believe the testimonies and corroborate. I mean, what we know in our profession is that the testimonies, for example, with the rape and stuff like this, torture, sometimes the people, the reaction of people with the emotion, it could be, you know, like that they could be sobbing, they could be shaking, they could be expressing great amount of emotion. But on the contrary, sometimes people are completely, should I say, split. I mean, and this is what we call in our field the clivage, meaning that each time you are experiencing some kind of a big trauma, you are splitted in between two parts. The part which is connected with the intellect and the part which is connected with the sensation. And we had a discussion earlier about the, you know, the difference in between what we called suffering from réminiscence and suffering from reviviscence. I don't know if it's the same term in English, but it means that when you are experiencing this kind of horrible, like forced to see the rape of another woman gathered with other people, I mean, we are on the side of what we call reviviscence. And why is it important? It's important because when you have to receive the testimony of these people, or much more, when you have to orientate these people on a therapeutical level, you have to understand that sometimes they would tell you terrible things, but without any emotion. And we have that type of problems, for example, with people applying for refugee status, you know, in front of the court in France. And sometimes the people, they are doubting of the testimonies. So my answer would be, maybe one of the answer would be to help the people like you receiving the testimonies to understand the layers that are composing the stories of the people, because these people also need some system of what we call defense and self-resistance. And it means that the people, if they don't want to break apart telling their stories, they need also to put some layers in between themselves and the public or the audience. So I think there are many, many things to do to help these people and also the scholars to go through the testimonies and maybe to go out from a fake debate, like whether it's true or not.
Thank you. Thank you. Getting winding up this session. Any of the panelists have any final thoughts? Please share with us. Otherwise, we will conclude this session.